Welcome back to another episode of Marcelina, my Reliance 44 sailboat rebuild project. Okay, quick recap of what I showed last time. I refinished and reinstalled all the cockpit woodwork. I messed up the process of removing the prop, and I messed up and damaged the prop shaft threads while removing the rudder. In this episode, I'm doing some remaining cockpit trim. I'll show the newly refurbished prop. We'll look at the reinstallation of the main winches, and we'll spend some time on how I'm building a new rudder and why I went this route. Also, we'll start prepping the hull for painting. Okay, on the cockpit trim, I had some help from my friend Paulo over the last few weekends, which I really appreciated. Here we're working on the companionway, making some modifications and prepping it for varnish. The outer lip of the companionway threshold had split, so I'm just cutting it back about ½ inch. I also installed the cockpit washdown shower with a piece of old floor as the frame. The new shower housing sat deeper into the boat, so the frame really just acts as a spacer so it'll fit. As far as the prop, after messing up the removal of the prop by disassembling the hub, which the manufacturer warned specifically against, I decided to send it to a dealer to reassemble it. They did a great job of putting it back together, along with repairing the tips of the blades and cleaning it up. Looks like a new prop. The winches sit on top of a large block of teak with some nylon washers. There are 6 long, ½ inch diameter bronze threaded rods that secure the base of the winch through a block of teak and then through the deck. Most of the original threaded rods had to be cut when I removed the winches, so I replaced all the rods with new silicon bronze as well as all the nuts and washers. I also used butyl sealant anywhere water could potentially penetrate into the block or into the boat. With the base installed, it was just a matter of sliding the rest of the winch in place. I had cleaned and greased the winches some time ago, but I'll still need to replace the pawls at some point because they're fairly worn. Okay, so the big project I've tackled over the last few months is the rudder. Here, I plotted out the rudder profile that I'm going to use, and I'm transferring it to a piece of plywood. I did some reading on rudder profiles and concluded that the rudder that I took off, made of a flat plate of steel, had some disadvantages for maneuverability and efficiency. It was fine if you're just sailing a straight line with the sails well balanced, but if you needed to produce some lift for turning or counteracting a bit of weather helm, then it wasn't really the best option. I ended up choosing what's called an NACA 0012 profile. It should give me good maneuverability and at typical sailboat speeds without creating excessive drag. To create the proper shape and act as a core, I chose Douglas fir, which is relatively strong for its weight, good in resisting rot, and fortunately it's cheap. I made the rudder in 2 halves using 2x10s of Douglas fir. The first layer here running fore and aft, and a second layer on top that runs top to bottom. This will give the core strength in both directions. Once I had all the core pieces epoxied in place, I attached the rudder profile that I had cut from plywood to the top and the bottom of the rudder. And then using a technique I learned from some wooden boat builders, shout out here to the Acorn Arabella guys, I set my router to just above the profile shape and created a groove across the width of the rudder. Then I could just use a power planer to quickly remove the wood until the groove disappeared. That way I knew I was close to the profile without going beyond it. Well, this worked great for removing the bulk of the extra wood, but I needed to make what I'm calling a bridge to get closer to the finished profile. I set the bridge a fixed distance above the surface and then routed much closer to the finished profile. First, I used a very aggressive rotary sander to take out these grooves, and then I switched to a random orbit sander to get a more even surface. Then it was time to fair the surface with thickened epoxy and sand it. I think I did this 3 times before I was reasonably happy. Once the profile was fairly even and smooth on one half, I flipped it over and made sure that the inner mating surface was flat. Of course, it wasn't smooth, so Paulo helped me here to find the high spots and even it out. This is important because I'll use this flat surface to lay out the other half of the rudder, and I want to make sure that both halves will end up mating together without any gaps. Before building the second half, I needed to cut out the recess for the prop and another slot for a bracket. I had made a template of these areas in the previous rudder and just transferred it to the new one. I also had some time for a little chat with the curious neighbor. Then back to work. With that done, I could construct the second half of the rudder on top of the first. I used a sheet of polyethylene film to separate the two halves, so that the epoxy I used wouldn't glue them together. Well, I don't want them glued together yet anyway. The process of shaping the second half was the same as the first. Lots of wood chips, lots of dust, and fair and sand, etc. We were also starting to get into some colder weather, so I constructed a little heated tent so that the epoxy was warm enough to cure. With both halves profiled, I needed to round off the cutout for the prop, which I had to do mostly by hand. This is to make sure that the prop wash flows over the rudder efficiently. Before routing out the inner surfaces to mate up with the steel shaft and supports, I needed to create registration holes. I lined up the outer edges of both halves and drilled a hole all the way through, and then used some threaded rod to keep them in place. This way, when I close up the two halves over the steel parts, everything should line up. The rudder shaft is also in 2 parts, one above and one below the prop, with both parts fairly close to the front edge of the rudder. The bottom part is only about 5 inches long, and it just sits in a bronze cup mounted to the back of the keel. This will support the weight of the rudder and creates a pivot point at the bottom. The upper part is about 4 feet long and will extend up into the hull of the boat. And I'm having 3 support pieces welded to this part of the shaft that will distribute the torque of the shaft into the rudder. I'm using duplex 2205 stainless steel for these parts because it's got superior corrosion resistance even when continuously submerged in salt water. As I'm making this video, I'm just waiting for the support pieces to be welded to the shaft. I also used my router along with an angled fixture to cut the grooves in the rudder halves where the support pieces will go. Once I get the shaft and the support pieces welded, I'll epoxy it all in one half and then epoxy the two halves together. With everything sealed together, I'll then fiberglass the outside and paint it. While I've been waiting for the steel fabrication to be done, I decided to start prepping the hull for painting. I cleaned the top sides and filled in all the little nicks and gouges with epoxy, and then sanded it with 220 grit sandpaper. When it gets warm enough, probably around March, I can prime and paint the hull. I also took some time to fill in the gap between the tow rail and the hull. I'm sure the hull joint is just fine and won't leak. I just want to do this for aesthetics. Well, that's it for this update. Next time I hope to have a finished rudder to show you, and maybe it'll even be reinstalled into the boat. Thanks for watching.